so thankful that everyone is here and we have the opportunity to have this particular seminar on Evangelism 101. As you recall, the elders of the congregation here have set a challenge before us as Christians at Westhill to reach out to those who are our friends and our neighbors and our co-workers, and in an effort to better equip the saints here at Westhill for that task, we have put together this Evangelism 101. I guess this idea started almost a year and a half or 2 years ago with Scott Barham, one of our deacons, and he was saying, we really need to have this class on evangelism. We need to have this. And I think part of that was the burning desire that he had to do evangelism himself and to be better at it, and pitched it to the elders, and it has evolved into what we are calling this year Evangelism 101. And to kick us off, we've got Brother Kirk Brothers. Kirk Brothers is one of the instructors at Freed-Hardeman University in Tennessee. He's been there about 5.5 years. He and his wife Cindy have 2 daughters, Katie and Hannah. Both are students at Freed-Hardeman. Prior to going to Freed-Hardeman, Brother Brothers, I knew I was going to throw that out in a minute. Kirk has done local work for about 23 years. Most of that as a pulpit minister, part of that also as a youth minister. He's worked in Tennessee and Kentucky and Mississippi. He also does work in Latin America, in doing mission work there. He's been in 8 countries as well as Latin America. Been going to Panama since 2005. Just recently, was it last week or the week before, got back from Panama, and so very busy man himself. He also directs the Horizon Leadership Camp that is done through Freed-Hardeman University. It is for youth throughout the nation, and they have quite a few teens that come out for that. He does have some information on Horizons and Freed-Hardeman back on the table in the very back. He may tell us a little bit more about that as well, either today or tomorrow. But without taking any more of his time, we'll turn it over to Kirk and let him address Evangelism 101.
Good evening, Mom. Can you hear me now? No? We good? Can you hear me now? Yeah, that would be a great commercial. All right. If anybody need a pen, if they want to take notes, all right, you'll just take one down, pass it around. Much more wholesome thing than another thing they take down. Have you got one? All right. These are my shameless plug. They're our Horizons Leadership Camp pens. So pass some of these around. I've got plenty, I think. Anybody else need a pen? Sorry. Got it? Yep. Sorry, I did not value him. Everybody good? All right, now if I could get some folks to help me pass some things out. Got some papers, if you could help me pass them around the room. Sorry for limping. When I stepped off today, something popped in my Achilles. So, there you go. There's one. And each of these, if you could just pass them around to everyone. And there's some more. These will tie into some of the things that we're going to talking about. I may not specifically walk through each one of them, but I wanted to have you to have some things that you could take with you. My PowerPoints, I'll leave with Sam and Scott, and they can distribute those however they wish. I am a visual learner, so I like things up where I can see them, and so hopefully that will help you as well. But I also know sometimes when you're trying to squeeze things in, even 2 hours is a long time, but when you're trying to squeeze in all the things that you might do in personal evangelism, then we're still going to go through things quickly, but I'll leave this with them, and then if y'all want, I know Scott talked about y'all getting ready to do personal evangelism class. He may want to use some of these slides as starter conversations, and so some things that I go through a little more quickly, he may want to take some time to talk about in more detail. While God's fishing up there, thank you for letting me be here tonight. Now, I've got my camera with me, so I need all of you to smile. Okay, are everybody ready? Because the Lord has let me go a lot of places in the world, and I've been to Texas before, but to my knowledge, this is the first time I got to preach in Texas. Okay, so it took a while for Texas to decide if they trusted me. And so, can y'all smile over here? Everybody ready? You ready? Okay. Cheese. Mostly this is so I can prove to my wife that I actually did something when I was here. Okay, y'all ready? Cheese. Corey back there posing. Okay. Thank y'all. Okay, we'll get a shot right through here. I'm a camera-aholic. I love taking pictures, and so I've always got a camera with me. And so just wanted to get some pictures. I'm looking forward to tomorrow. I scoped on the way to the hotel some pictures I'm going to take in the morning on the way back. President Roosevelt was stricken with polio in 1921, and he would struggle with that up until his death in 1945. Here's another handout on the Tell Your Story. I think I want to work that around. The handout that says Be Our Guest is what we're going to look at worship in the morning. President Roosevelt was stricken with polio in 1921, and he struggled with it up until his death in 1945. On the 10th anniversary of his death, Dr. Jonas Salk announced to the world that he had a polio vaccine that had been tested, approved, was ready for marketing and use. And so the world finally had a cure for a disease that struck hundreds of thousands of people across the globe. Over 30 years later, in the late 1980s, do you think polio was eliminated? Not completely. There were thousands of vials of polio vaccine in refrigerators and storage units at plants all over the United States. And there were still hundreds of thousands of cases of polio around the world. The problem was not demand. There were hundreds of thousands of people who needed the vaccine. The problem was not supply, because there were thousands of vials that were going unused. The problem was distribution. Jesus told his disciples that the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. I want you to just guess with me. How many people do you think lived on the planet when Jesus looked across the world as co-creator of all that is and said, the harvest is plentiful? How many people do you think existed, lived on the planet when Jesus made this statement? I want to venture a guess. Okay, I've got one guess, 2 million. 20 million? 100 million. Okay. Anybody else? You probably can Google it and get an idea. Best estimate I've been able to find from just doing some research is that in the first century, we had somewhere between 200 and 300 million people on the earth. That's roughly the population of the United States of America. How many people live on the earth now? Okay, I think we're north of 7 billion. All right, 2,000 years ago, we had between 200 and 300 million. Now we have 700 billion plus. It is estimated that we will add almost 80 million people a year, 287,000 plus to the planet every day. Now I want you to think about something. If with a world of at max maybe 300 million people or thereabout, Jesus said the harvest is plentiful. If Jesus were doing this lesson tonight in a world of 7 billion people, what would he say? I mean, if it was plentiful then, it is beyond today. The opportunities are there. Every minute has been estimated that 99 people die every minute. And most of those are going to die not knowing Jesus. Two professors I had at one of the schools I went to, in a book that they wrote, estimated that in the year 2025, there will be over 2 billion people on the planet who will never have heard the story of Jesus. Now, we're not even dealing there with those who may have heard an incorrect description of the story of Jesus and how you come to Jesus. We're not even dealing there with those who've heard the story of Jesus and the message of the gospel and chose not to respond to it. We're talking about those who have been unevangelized. That means they've never, ever heard the story. Truly, more so than ever before, the harvest is plentiful. I've got a class that I'm in the middle of teaching right now called Electronic Media Evangelism, and one of the things we talked about last week, we talked about all of the mass media outlets that Paul used, and we discussed what would Paul do in today's world. What would he do with the internet? What would he do with Facebook and web pages and Snapchat and YouTube? All of those different outlets that we have now that allows you at a few clicks to share things literally with thousands or even millions of people. We've got more opportunities than ever before. And we've got more means of getting things out to people than ever before. Yet in most places, the church isn't growing, and people aren't being converted. The blood of Jesus, is there a lack of supply? No. There's plenty. The point I'm making, the problem is not demand, and the problem is not supply. Whether it's the supply of the blood of Jesus, or whether it's the supply of people who need to be saved, or even means of getting the message out. The problem is distribution. There's too few of us who are trying to get the cure to those who are sick. So I hope this weekend, if nothing else comes out of this, I hope it inspires us and motivates us to think about what can I do more. The reality is we're able to have this class and we're able to be in this room because Jesus shared His blood and because somebody else shared His story with us. All of us are here because somebody shared with him. Bill is here because Corey shared with him. All of us are here. And I think about people in my life like my mom and my dad and Benny Burns and Taylor, Miss Ann Taylor and others who shared the message of Jesus with me. And were it not for them, I wouldn't be standing here. All of us are here because somebody took the time to share it with us. A Savior took the time to share His blood on a cross, and somebody took the time to enter into the story of my life and share His story with me. And I guess nothing else, I think it's just right. It's just fair for us to share. Because whoever shared it with us didn't have to. And Jesus didn't have to go to that cross. In John chapter 10, He says, "No one takes my life, I lay it down freely." It's my choice. But He chose to do that. And for me, Joe and Dorothy Brothers, and Benny Burns, and Ann Taylor and others, they chose to share with me. It's only fair that I share what was shared with me. And so this weekend, we're going to talk about different things. We're going to basically what I'm going to do is talk about some things I do in Bible studies. Is it the only way? No. I don't know that it's even the best way. But they are some things that work for me, some things that I have found helpful in settings I've been in, that I've seen others do, and a lot of this I've learned from other people. But I want you, as we look at this, to realize that what I'm trying to do is share you some general ideas to whet your appetite and to inspire you to keep studying, to keep learning, to keep growing. And I hope that this is the beginning of a long string of training workshops and Bible classes, because there truly are a lot of things available to us. And as we think about this concept of sharing the gospel with others, I don't think there's one right way. But we just need to do something. And sometimes we're so concerned with doing it perfectly that we don't do anything. And I basically think when it comes to talking about Jesus with somebody else, or at least asking them if they want to, okay, if you don't get anything else I talk about, get this. Be kind, be respectful, be Christ-like, and ask them. There's no set way, there's no set formula. If you're kind, you're respectful, and you're Christ-like, and you ask them some way, somehow, then you've done what God's called you to do. And if they say yes, then open the Bible and start talking to them about your Jesus and my Jesus and the one who died to save the world. So as we look at what we're going to try to look at tonight, let me find my clock. Is there a clock in here? Saying this is good to preach at a place that doesn't have a visible clock. When I preached at the Graymere congregation in Columbia, they recorded our services every Sunday. And so my lessons had to be 28 and a half minutes, no more than 29, because they were going to be broadcast. And so I said, okay, I need to be able to gauge that. Okay, and you have your clock up on the pulpit, but then when you get up there, and it starts from whenever I start. So like if the singing goes over 15 minutes, well, my time is the same. It doesn't change one way or another. And so like you're walking up there and you're trying to say, okay, if I add 28 and a half minutes to that, what does that come up to? And I said, listen, I want a clock in the back that counts down from 28 and a half. Well, they couldn't do 28 and a half, but they did have one that counted down from 29. And it came to be known in the congregation as a shot clock, okay? And so when I would get up there, as it's counting down, I'm thinking, okay, man, I got another point to go. We've really got to move on. The problem is, what do people start doing? Good, he's almost done. And then some weeks they're like, it's broken, okay? But, so, since I don't have a clock, don't have a shot clock, I'm just assuming as long as we quit somewhere around midnight, we're all good. So somebody give me, like Sam or, I don't know if Scott's back there. By the way, I appreciate them getting me safely from the airport. And I know, especially Scott, I think his daughter's not feeling well today, and so he may be in and out. But if you would just like, when you do this, when it's time or break, since everybody's had enough for a time and want to break, just wave at me. Here are the two things I'd like to talk about or give some highlights of tonight. I want to talk about some thoughts on connecting to studies, and then some thoughts on that I think are helpful, at least for me, as far as conducting a study. Okay, so what are some things pre-study? What are some things in a study? All right, as we think about a contact list, some things we may talk about in certain portions of this, you'll say, been there, done that. Then there'll be something else you'll say, hadn't thought about that. And hopefully as we go through it, all of us will have some things maybe we haven't thought about before. First of all, you kind of have to have two teams when it comes to outreach. You need a team out there doing studies, and then you need a team helping those folks get studies. And you have some folks that are doing all of the above. But I want to begin with the idea of having a team that is conducting studies. Now, first of all, Peter says that all of us should be able to give a reason for what we believe. That's expected of all of us. Peter is dealing with those who are being persecuted for Christ. And so he says we should know what we believe and why we believe it. That's expected of everybody. Now, I don't know if any of you come across the book Soul Searching? I don't know if some of y'all may have come across it along. It came out in 2005. It is a study which is basically a reporting of the National Study of Youth and Religion. It was the largest study of the lives of teenagers that's ever been done in religious lives. Very extensive study. Since then, they've had 4 more books that have come out as they've tracked those young people into their college years, into their post-college years. But one of the main things they learned from the study that is not only true of young people, that I think is true of folks of all ages, is that as they went through the study and they talked about key teachings of faith, key beliefs, that by and large, they struggled to say what they believed in or why. And one of the things that the researchers talked about, I actually had a chance at a conference to hear one of them speak about some of the research they did. But one of the things they found in the study, and that Lisa mentioned in that talk, was we got the distinct impression nobody had ever asked them before. In other words, nobody had ever said, do you believe in Jesus, and what do you believe about Jesus? Nobody had ever said, what do you believe about God? Does that make sense? So they didn't know what they believed and struggled to say why they believed it, and nobody had ever asked them. And so what the study is saying, the study's not pointing a finger at the young folks. It's pointing the finger at us. Now, that study, they happen to be looking at young people. I think they could have done the same study of age 30, age 40, age 50, age 60. They could have done it with a lot of different ages, and I think they would find that by and large, many times we don't know, we can't articulate what we believe or why we believe it. The reason I'm saying that is every Christian should know the basics of what we believe and why. So I think one thing that's an important building block, if you will, in that process of evangelism is having some classes that deal with the basics of faith. Some Christian evidences classes dealing with the existence of God, the nature of God, the nature of Jesus, confidence we can have in God's Word, etc. Some basic classes on Christian evidences. But also some basic classes on basic beliefs. What does the Bible teach about the nature of the church? What does the Bible teach about the organization of the church? What does the Bible teach about worship? And those basic classes, I'm not saying we don't study those things, but I think it will help a lot, tremendously, if we can have some classes that are targeted, not just covering the material, but actually then talking about how do I articulate that. Helping folks compile a series of passages that they could go to on different basic topics related to faith, so that if somebody asks them, why do you guys do this? That they've at least got somewhere to go. We used to do that. I remember on Sunday night, I mentioned Benny Burns. He was a preacher when I was a kid and growing up in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. On Sunday night, he would get the kids down front, and we memorized verses. And a lot of the verses I quote in sermons today, I got when I was pre-10, because he gathered us down front. And we had to memorize verses related to the plan of salvation, key verses about the need to share the gospel, or about the nature of the church, or Jesus saying, upon this rock I will build my church. Those key passages that have stayed with me the rest of my life. And we don't do much memorization anymore. We don't plug into that as much. I'm a big believer in practicing and role play. And so it's one thing, like for me in a class, to say, here's what the Bible teaches about the church. It's another thing to say, okay, having talked about this for the last 30 minutes, I want you to break up in groups of pair and groups of two, and I want for the next 10 minutes, you're going to teach her about the nature of the church. Then the next 10 minutes, you're going to teach her about the nature of the church. Or we're going to pass out a piece of paper, and okay, on one page, I want you to summarize what we talked about today. And then come back and say, okay, how did it go with everybody? Where did you feel uncomfortable? What do you wish we had dealt with? What can we reinforce? What questions came out of your discussion? There's much to be. It's one thing to just list a bunch of verses. It's another thing to practice articulating what I believe. Okay, one of the things they do in counseling is they found that being able to either in writing or by speaking to let things out of you helps in the process of healing. So, for example, if you've got a conflict with somebody, often writing a letter to them, whether they ever see the letter or not, you will start feeling better. Okay, if you see me driving down the road and it looks like I'm talking to myself, one or two things are happening. Number one, I'm practicing my next lesson. Number two, I am verbally walking through a conflict so that it's not a conflict anymore. Does that make sense? As I'm driving down the road, I talk as if I'm talking to the person, and it relaxes me, and I don't need to talk to them anymore. Now, sometimes you do have to talk. You've got to work something out. But if I'm upset about something, I find often talking about it to myself. Yes, I do talk to myself. And folks say that's okay as long as you don't answer. Now, I'm going to tell you, I think you should answer because it's rude not to talk back to people. So the point I'm making is role play has power. And, for example, you're not going to put a pitcher in the game for the first time in the 9th inning of Game 7 of the World Series. You want some bullpen time. You want some practice time. So I am a big believer in, and that's one of the things Scott and I have talked about, and Sam, and I think you guys are going to do in your classes, is practice, role play. For example, I have just started our personal evangelism class. I've got about 60, 80 college kids that attend where we're at, and so I do their Bible class on Wednesday night, and this semester they wanted to do a class on personal evangelism. So most weeks what we'll do is we'll talk about some things you can say, then the other half of the class, they'll be practicing on each other. So I just want to challenge us. All of us need to know what we believe, whether it's a personal evangelism thing or not. We all need to know that. And so that's one way we can help in the process of personal evangelism, is have classes that build on that and help us to articulate what it is that we believe. Now, having said that all of us need to articulate our faith, I want you to think about, in places like Romans chapter 12, it says that God gave certain gifts to the body. In fact, Paul, in writing to the Corinthian brethren, he said God put every part in the body just as he wanted it, in 1 Corinthians 12. Now, notice what is one of the gifts. It's the gift of teaching, right? So doesn't that imply that not everybody has it? Every Christian should be able to say, here's why I believe. But not every Christian is ready or equipped to teach. Now, I'm not saying that so we get an easy out. Oh, well, that's me. I'm not equipped. Well, I'm going home. No, that's not my point. I may not be there yet, but I can be there. Okay? All of us were taught in high school by people at one point in their life who couldn't teach high school. But they learned how to teach in high school. The point I'm trying to make is you've got 270 members, but not all 270 members are ready to go out and do studies. So you start with those who are ready. So think about what could be done if you started with this group. And then you encourage that group, you resource that group, you train that group. And so this is beginning. We've already talked about some avenues you've got close to you with Fishers of Men trainers that live in the area. You've got John Moore that lives in the area. You've got a lot of opportunities to do ongoing training. So I want to challenge you, begin to identify those that are ready to do studies now, get them resources, and get them ongoing training. Now, what Jesus did is Jesus knew that it was not enough for him to die on a cross. And you may say, well, that's crazy. You mean my Savior is not sufficient? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is if he dies on the cross and nobody knows about it, it doesn't do anyone any good. Dr. Salk coming up with a cure for polio doesn't do any good if the world doesn't know it exists. Remember that newspaper headline that was up there? Jesus understood that. And so Jesus didn't start his public ministry till he was 30. We think his public ministry was somewhere between 2.5 to 3.5 years, but approximately 3 years. And most of that time, how big was his audience? 12. Now, there were others there, we know. And we know we had the crowds and the thousands and the multiplying of the loaves and fishes for the thousands. But much of his energy was spent on 12 people. They were his personal evangelism team. And what he did with them is, first of all, he let them watch him teach. They watched him teach. He let them role play and simulate things. For example, if you look over in John chapter 6, if You've got a large crowd there. He's about to feed them with the loaves and fishes, but basically he is going to ask one of the local guys, how do we feed these people? Okay, the apostle he asks, Thomas, in fact, the two guys that speak up are from the local area. They knew where all the McDonald's were. Okay, so they knew, it would have been McDavid's, I'm sure, back then. But they knew how you would feed a lot of people in that area. The text in John 6 says Jesus knew what he was going to do. He wasn't asking for information. He was asking for instructive purposes. Okay, guys, if you were in charge, what would you do if you had the Son of God standing with you? I would trust his power and I'd ask him. That's the answer Jesus wanted. He wanted them to trust him. Instead of seeing the power of the Messiah, all they could think about is how much it would cost. That was a test. And so he would often put them in role-playing situations. If you look in Luke chapter 10, in verses 1 through 3, he's going to send them out in pairs to practice what they've learned. But before they went out, verses 4 and following, he gives them instructions for what to do. Do y'all remember that? He said, don't take a bag. He says, don't take a long, I came here, I had a backpack and a suitcase. That's why we didn't ride the Harley back from the airport, okay? Because we were trying to picture how that's going to pull behind the motorcycle, okay? But Jesus said, no, don't take a suitcase with you. Don't take any money with you. You just go preach. Now, why is he doing that? I think he's teaching them to trust. In other words, he gave them specific instructions. He said, when you get into a city, don't jump from house to house. If there's a family that lets you come in and stay with them, don't jump from house to house. Why? Well, what if the third day there, you convert the wealthiest man in town? I'm staying with him. Well, he said, don't jump to the wealthy man's house. Powerful, powerful message to those of us who are preachers who jump from congregation to congregation for a little bigger house. He said, don't jump from house to house. You've got a place to stay. Be content with the house you're in. And the point I'm making is he gave very specific instructions. He had training, so they watched him do it. They role-played different aspects. They were given specific instructions, and then they did mission trips. He would send them out in pairs and say, okay, I'm going into this city, this city, this city. You are to do an advance campaign and get the city ready for me. You tell them the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The Messiah is coming. You make preparations for where we eat, what we're going to eat and where we're going to live, and then I'll come in. And they would go out on these little mini mission trips, and then when they would come back, Jesus would debrief them and give them instruction. And then finally, when he went back to heaven, in Acts chapter 1, he turned it over to them. But he got them ready first. And so that's what needs to be happening. And so I want to encourage you to continue to do that, and this is a part of that process. All right, so we need a team doing studies, and I hope that'll be everybody in this room. But then we also need everybody else mobilized to help them get studies. Anybody know Jerry Jenkins? Passed away a few years ago. Jeff preaches not far down the road, and I was in college, in grad school a little bit with his son Dale. Known the family for a long time. We had him come in and do an evangelism workshop when I was at the Graymere congregation in Columbia. And as we were talking about things they did, one of the things he talked about is how not everybody in the congregation did studies. I mean, I think they probably had 15 to 20 doing studies at any given time. But everybody else in the congregation was looking for studies. They were trying to get studies for the 20 people who were doing studies all the time. And that's huge. And we have to think about, where do we start with our Bible studies? Okay, because I can say, hey, I want to go evangelize. Well, where do I start? And what I found is in a lot of congregations, now I know, what you say, you had 15 or 20 baptisms last year? Is that about right? And so y'all may be doing this, but a lot of congregations I find aren't even studying the Bible with the people who have already told them they want to study. You know how they told us? They show up every week. If they didn't want to study the Bible, they're not showing up every week. Now, they may come 2 or 3 weeks because there's some pretty little girl down the way that they want to date, but after a while, it goes beyond that. And so those people are practically shouting to us, would you talk to me? And so I think all processes start with who's coming all the time right now who is not a child of God. Then you look at who's visiting. Who do we have that has been in our building or has been to something we have done? My experience has been, others may have had different experiences. My experience has been, I don't have tons of studies that are cold turkey, where I meet somebody on the side of the road and we're both buying a hot dog at a hot dog stand and say, you want to study the Bible? And they say, great, and we go to Central Park and we have a Bible study. That's not been my experience. Now, I'm not saying that I haven't had a study with somebody I just met. But I'm saying, by and large, most folks I've studied with had some previous encounter with a child of God. They've had some previous contact. If not with me, then with somebody else. And we're going to talk about that a little more in Bible class tomorrow, and therefore the role that each of us play in opening the doors for personal evangelism. So who's already had some contact with us? Who brought their children to Vacation Bible School? Who went to a teen devo? And in most congregations, if you just start with who comes all the time, or at least semi-regularly, that's not a child of God, and who has visited us in the last year, you've got a list that will keep you busy for a while. And then you begin to think about context each of you have. Let me ask you something. How many folks think you could come up with a list right now tonight of 5 people that you know that you wish would become children of God? Everybody think they could come up with 5? You've already got a contact list. If all 40 or 50 people in this room wrote down their 5 people, then you've suddenly got a starting list. Let me ask you this. How many of us in this room know one person who would be willing to study the Bible? Just one. That you know, without even asking, that you know they would be willing to study the Bible. Got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so we've got 6 Bible studies right now. In other words, most of us, if we'll just start thinking, we'll realize there are people we already know that are willing. We've just never made them a target. And I don't want it to be impersonal by talking about it being a target. But if you and I are fishers of people, don't you have to throw the bait at something? Right? Or the net at something? And so what I want to challenge you to do, one of the first things you do is you start generating a list. Who is it that we have contact with? Who is it that right now we think might be open? And then you begin the process of let's go talk to these people. And I'll be honest with you, I bet if this group got together in a class on a Wednesday night, I bet you could have 50 to 60 people's names on a list. Boom, just like that. Then you begin the process of saying, okay, who is going to talk to whom? And that's often what you do. You create a contact list, and then you say, who knows this person? Who knows this person? Who knows this person? All right, Susie, you said you know this person. Will you go to John sometime between now and next Wednesday and ask John if he would have a Bible study? When you start reducing it to names, who is it I know? Who in my family? Who in my neighborhood? Who in my class? Who in my club? On my team? We have to get it down to names and addresses and phone numbers and emails, etc. All right, one of the things that I did on one of your handouts there, it's got some questions that you might ask. How do I begin a study? Again, I find that it usually starts with a relationship. It also requires looking for the opportunity. We often pass by opportunities. My dad is one of the most evangelistic people I've ever met. In fact, he and a guy named Maydale McKinney are the 2 most evangelistic folks I've ever met. Brother McKinney was full-time Army. He did 3 tours in Vietnam. My dad is a mechanical engineer. He's retired, I guess. but I guess once you're a mechanical engineer, you're always a mechanical engineer. He didn't go to a Christian school. He didn't major in Bible. But I can't begin to tell you how many people he's done Bible studies with. And my guess is he studied with 5 to 10 people this week. And he basically ended up retiring in part so he could do more Bible studies. But one of the things Dad talked to me about is he said most people will open the door, even the most hardened person will open the door one time in their life. And if you don't stick your foot in the door, you may not get it again. And he said, you can't wait till it's convenient. When it opens, you've got to go through that door. And I also remember my dad saying, and I'll probably repeat this again in Bible class tomorrow, he says, I hear preachers tell me, I can't get Bible studies. And he says, I've got more Bible studies than I can shake a stick at. He said, the problem is not that people don't want to study. The problem is nobody's asking. So I want to go back to what I said at the beginning. I tried on this piece of paper to give you some things you might say to open a conversation. But there's not one perfect right way. I'm a big believer in tact. Does that make sense? Don't be rude. That is really important to me. That if I am genuinely concerned and caring and nice when I ask, then I'm not sure there is a wrong way to ask. There's not just one formula. So I put on there, you might say, what's your name? What's your name? Paul. Brother Paul. Brother Paul, we've been friends for a long time. Remember we went on that fishing trip and, well, I caught all the trout, and I hope someday you'll learn to fish as well as I do. But we've had a lot of fun together, haven't we? We've never really talked about this, and it's kind of maybe weird between us, but you ever think about God? Do you ever study the Bible, any of that kind of stuff?
I do when you tell me those fish stories.
So, what about fish stories makes you think about God?
I just think he is a great creator to create something like that. Those beautiful surroundings, get close to nature. I think God's involved in nature, don't you?
Yeah, I believe. I believe God is the reason it all exists. And I believe every fish that's been made is a part of His plan. You ever read the Bible? Have you ever, for example, looked at the Bible account of the creation?
I peruse through it. I hear about it spoken by a lot in public. A lot of things don't match up.
Okay, give me some examples of some things that don't match up that frustrate you.
Well, about how God is active in this person's life and they lead a different life in private.
Okay. Kind of the hypocrisy, is that kind of what you have?
Or
some who claim to be?
Which political group is God going to bless?
Yeah, okay.
A lot of confusing questions out there.
Nancy, I love to study the same things. Would you be okay with us sitting down and just studying together, looking at what God says and what His plan for His people is?
Love to.
Okay. Most days I get off at about 5 o'clock. And I know that you're usually off Thursday nights and sometimes on Saturdays when we're not fishing. Do you have a Thursday or a Saturday over the next few weeks or even just in the next week that we could get together? Because, man, I'd love to sit down and talk about this.
Sure. Let me know what's best for you.
I want to challenge you, when you're talking to somebody, there's not a right formula. You're friends. Now, he and I have never met each other before, but just say something. I think it's important when you go into it to think about, sorry for putting my feet on that, excuse me. But for me, I don't know if it's like that for other folks, but for me, I need to already have in mind when I could do that study. Because if you just say sometime, I need to be able to give options. I need to know when I'm free or I could be made free. There are some things I can't change. But there are some things in my schedule that I could change. Maybe I was planning to go to a movie tonight, but I could miss a movie for us to have a study. A funeral, I can't change that. So I already have in my mind what is it that's free for me, And then I can say, hey, when do you get off? Is there a day or a time that's good for you? What have been the experiences of some of you? Has that, when you've set up studies, to be able to set a time and a place?
To avoid having a specific, trying to dodge out a little bit. So, well, no, this coming Thursday, I've got a lot of other things promised. So then what would you say?
Well, I'd look for another Thursday, or I'd look for a Saturday. I'd begin to ask, okay, is there a time, when are you free? Because I know we both have a lot of things going. But to start with, I just like 1 hour. And sometimes I'll take any portion of a time I can get. I find sometimes you might be able to work in a lunchtime. I think it's important to try to do everything in your power to get a set time and place before that conversation ends. It's very important for me to not leave with some kind of commitment, and I want to try not to leave with, we'll get together sometime. Now, that's a start. If they tell me they're willing to study sometime, then that gives me permission to come back. So that's worth something. I've gained some ground. I haven't got a touchdown, but I got a first down. Okay, so we're making progress. But I like, if possible, to have an agreement on a set time and place, even if it's just for 30 or 45 minutes to make a start. If I absolutely can't work it out, sometimes I'll try to get something into their hands or make them aware of something that they can do or read or study or watch. Like World Video Bible School, I notice y'all have got them here. I've given them away to a lot of congregations. Get something into their hands, if at all possible. Of course, that's assuming you have it on you. And the opportunity for study, it may not always be in your pocket when you're standing in line at McDonald's or wherever it is you have that encounter. To me, that's big. And one of the things I've noticed in doing studies with people, it used to be, I remember Brother McKinney, okay? I'll go back to the brother that influenced me tremendously in personal evangelism. He used to talk about you want to go where they feel comfortable, not where you feel comfortable. Well, that used to be back in the 70s in your house or your house. But what I'm running into more and more is that their homes have become their fortress. And they don't feel as comfortable with you coming to their house. Now, that may not be the situation here in your community, so each community can be different. But what are you running into? I mean, does that make sense? In your community, if somebody wanted to do a study, would they rather do it at their house? You say no.
For me, I know, having people, I'd rather, Starbucks or somewhere kind of open. And that's how I feel it's been comfortable for some of the people that I've come across or talked to.
It used to be like, I learned to do Bible studies at the feet of my dad. My dad, again, was a mechanical engineer. He's a workaholic. He'd work 60, 80 hours a week. But he'd come in, and when he'd come in, we'd eat supper, and then he'd say, Kirk, we're doing a Bible study. And he had the old Jewel Miller film strips, okay, and I was the ding man. Now, I didn't say ding bat, Sam. I said ding man. If y'all remember the old Jewel Miller film strips, you had a cassette player, and you put it in, and then you had the reel-to-reel. Well, when it got through talking about a given slide, it would go ding. Well, my job was to stay awake and turn the slide. Well, I can't tell you how many studies I did with my dad where I'm just turning that slide. Almost every study I did with my dad was in the home of the people we studied with. I just find that more and more people aren't crazy about somebody coming in their home. They're worried that they've got to clean things up and they've got to vacuum and do all these things before somebody comes into their home. I'm finding more and more they would rather do it somewhere else. Now, I recognize that because of my position as a preacher and at school, I have an office, but I found by and large when I start talking to people, they just soon come to my office. I don't know what y'all run into. So like if some of you are at a business and you got a place, or sometimes they just soon come up to the church building somewhere and find a room off to the side where you can have a little privacy, but that they feel safe and secure. In your home, sometimes they would like to go to your house. But sometimes they kind of feel outnumbered in your house because that's your territory. But they aren't ready to let you into their territory. So if we can find neutral ground somewhere, and sometimes that can be at a Starbucks or somewhere public, but somewhere where you can have a conversation and talk about things. There are some places public that it's just so loud you can't talk or hear each other talk. And so a part of that process is exploring where they might like to have the study, but I think it's important for me to have a couple of alternatives, because a lot of folks are like, well, I mean, it really doesn't matter to me. That's a lot of times the feedback I get back, and then I can say, well, what about this or this? Are those your experiences? Yes, no, maybe. I guess with this, what I want to challenge us to do is, in a nice, kind way, you need usually some kind of lead-in question. And that may be different for different people. All right? If the We Care ministry guys, they always start out with, if you died right now, do you know for sure, beyond a shadow of doubt, that you would go to heaven? And I have used that in studies, but I tend to use that at the end. Okay, I usually lead in with something else. Okay, but for them that works. I think the key is think of something you can start with that gets them thinking about spiritual things. Okay, do you go to church anywhere? Now, I understand that church is not a place you go to, it's the people. But most folks, if they don't know Jesus, they don't think about it that way. So when they have a certain understanding of that, so if I say, do you go to church anywhere, that immediately becomes a lead-in conversation. Well, yes, I go over here. Oh, that's great. Tell me who your preacher there is. Great. Well, what did y'all talk about? And then you just start talking. Well, it sounds to me like you really believe in God. You love to study His Word. Well, I'm the same way. Would you be willing to get together? I'd love for us to study. I've got Tuesday and Thursday open this week. What about that? Or we could go to lunch together, and maybe you could talk about some things that you have learned, and I can do the same. We just kind of study God's Word together. So that may be different, but basically I want some kind of lead-in question that allows me to get into their spiritual sphere. Am I helping any at all? And so what I tried to do in the little handout is just to give you some discussion starters. Okay, things you might ask. And so often, do you ever think about God? Or do you worship with a Christian? Do you ever read the Bible? Do you enjoy reading the Bible, etc.? And based on their response, then I can go in all kinds of different directions. But basically, I'm wanting to find out if they're already interested in God or if they're at least open to talking about God. And then as soon as they give me that crack, then I can ask the question. If I get any kind of hint that they enjoy the Bible, believe in God, think about God on a fishing trip, anything that lets me know, at least one point in their lives, they've thought about something spiritual, then that is my crack in the door. And that, at least for me, that's what I use to begin to talk about it. But I do think it's important to already have in your mind when you might do it and some possible places you might do it. And I like, if at all possible, to set up something within the next week. Let's talk about some don'ts and some do's. You want to take a break? Okay, let's take a break.